The sergeant's face, red with rage moments before, instantly blanched, turning white as paper. His wide eyes fixed on the badge, then on the woman he had just humiliated and harassed. His air of superiority dissolved into icy panic. He tried to stammer something, but the words died in his throat. The crowd, which had been watching curiously, now murmured in shock and satisfaction. The colonel, without averting her gaze, took the radio from her belt. Central Colonel Mendez, requesting a patrol car and an internal affairs team for Rua das Palmeiras, number 120. We have a sergeant who needs to be detained for harassment and abuse of authority. And please, a medic for his finger, he'll need it. The air on Rua das Palmeiras, previously thick with dust and indignation, now weighed heavy with the stunned silence that followed Colonel Mendez's words. It was not a silence of peace, but of shock, of a revelation that tore through the veil of normalcy. The sergeant, whose name hadn't even been spoken, but whose face contorted in a grotesque mix of pain and terror, seemed to have shrunk. His uniform, once a symbol of unquestionable authority, now looked like a ridiculous disguise, stained by his own villainy. His eyes, previously fixed on the badge that sealed his fate, shifted to the crowd. There, he found no compassion, but a mix of scorn and an almost palpable satisfaction. The people, once mere spectators of an everyday drama of power abuse, became witnesses to instant and brutal justice. Murmurs spread like wildfire through dry straw, each whisper a condemnation, each gaze a judgment. It was the end of his petty tyranny, exposed under the merciless midday sun. Colonel Mendez, for her part, remained impassive. Her gaze, cold and penetrating, showed no triumph, but an iron determination. For her, this was not a moment of personal revenge, but the fulfillment of a duty. That sergeant was merely a symptom of a larger disease she had sworn to combat. Her radio, still in her hand, was a link to the greater machinery of justice, and her voice, speaking to Central, was the voice of the law, unwavering and without hesitation. Central Colonel Mendez, requesting a patrol car and an internal affairs team for Rua das Palmeiras, number 120. We have a sergeant who needs to be detained for harassment and abuse of authority. And please, a medic for his finger. He'll need it. The coldness with which the colonel requested a medic for the man she had just incapacitated was almost as shocking as the breaking of the finger itself. It was proof that her action had not been an impulsive act, but a calculated execution, a surgical strike to dismantle arrogance. The sergeant, now kneeling, clutching his fractured finger, looked like a disarticulated doll, his physical pain merely a pale echo of the collapse of his reality. Within minutes, the sound of sirens tore through the air, announcing the imminent arrival of internal affairs. 2 patrol cars and an unmarked vehicle approached, their lights flashing, painting the scene with a blue and red glow. The first officers to disembark, young and visibly confused, were met by a surreal image, a woman in civilian clothes, but with the bearing of a general, and a sergeant from their own force, known for his truculence, prostrate on the ground, pale and trembling. "Colonel Mendez, ma'am," one of the younger officers stammered, recognizing the rank on the badge she still held. His eyes widened at the sight of Sergeant Silva, his superior, in that condition. "Sergeant Silva," the colonel indicated with a nod, her voice cutting through the air like a blade. "Detain him. Abuse of authority, harassment. Internal Affairs is on its way to formalize the arrest and initiate the inquiry." The officers, trained to obey, hesitated for an instant, their minds trying to process the order. Arrest a colleague, a superior, on the accusation of a disguised colonel? It was something that defied the hierarchy and camaraderie instilled in them. But Colonel Mendez's badge and the unquestionable authority in her voice was stronger. They approached Sergeant Silva, who was now trying to stand, a mix of plea and despair on his face. "No, please, Colonel, I can explain." He tried, his voice choked by pain and panic. "There's nothing to explain, Sergeant. the colonel replied without a hint of emotion. "Your actions spoke for themselves. You dishonored the uniform, the institution, and public trust, and I, as your colonel, will not tolerate it." As the officers handcuffed him, Sergeant Silva let out a groan of pain, both physical and moral. His career, his reputation, everything crumbled there in broad daylight before an audience he had tried to intimidate. The irony was cruel, justice relentless. The Internal Affairs team arrived shortly after, led by a serious-faced major who quickly assessed the situation. He and Colonel Mendez exchanged a brief but significant look. Few words were needed. The story was written in the scene before them. The major nodded, a sign of understanding, and that protocol would be strictly followed. The medic, called to attend to the sergeant, arrived with the ambulance, and the officer's embarrassment was even greater as he was examined right there, in the middle of the street, with his finger visibly disfigured. The pain, once a mere discomfort, was now a searing torment, a constant reminder of his downfall. Colonel Mendez observed the scene with a disturbing calm. For her, that was just the first step. That incident was a microcosm of a larger problem, an open wound that needed to be cauterized. Internal Affairs would act, the inquiry would be rigorous, and the message would be clear. Corruption and abuse would have no place in her force. Rua das Palmeiras that day witnessed not just the arrest of a sergeant, but the beginning of a cleanup that promised to shake the deepest structures of the police, and she, Colonel Mendez, was just getting started. The rumble of the ambulance engine mingled with the murmur of the crowd, creating a dissonant soundtrack for Sergeant Silva's spectacle of disgrace. He was lifted, his arm twisted at an unnatural angle to accommodate his fractured finger, and pushed into the vehicle. His face, once a mask of arrogance, was now a map of pain and humiliation. His eyes fixed on a distant point, as if trying to detach himself from the reality that was swallowing him whole. His uniform, once impeccable, now looked crumpled, dirty, a mirror of his exposed soul. Colonel Mendez observed the scene with an almost cold calm. There was no satisfaction in her gaze, only the confirmation that the first stage of a long journey had been completed. The sergeant was merely a pawn, a visible symptom of a systemic disease that corroded the force from within. His removal was necessary, but not sufficient. The Internal Affairs major, a middle-aged man with a forehead furrowed by years of confrontations with bureaucracy and internal corruption, approached her. His eyes, tired but perceptive, met the colonel's. "Colonel Mendez," he began, his voice low but firm, "an efficient job. You have my full support." She nodded without looking away from where the sergeant had fallen. "Major, this is just the beginning. Sergeant Silva didn't act alone. He felt safe to act this way because he knew there was a network of connivance, of silence, perhaps even complicity, that would protect him. I want you to investigate thoroughly, not just his actions, but the environment that allowed them to thrive." The major, who knew Colonel Mendez's reputation, knew she wasn't kidding. "Understood, Colonel. We'll track every call, every ignored complaint, every superior who turned a blind eye. Internal Affairs will conduct a complete sweep of his battalion." "Excellent," she replied, finally turning to him. Her eyes were an icy blue, but charged with unwavering determination. "I want daily reports. And I want the message to be clear. Impunity is over. Anyone involved in any way will be held accountable. Rank doesn't matter." The crowd, still gathered, began to disperse slowly, some with smiles of relief, others with looks of admiration for the woman who had defied authority and won. Rua das Palmeiras, which was once just another street in a large city, now carried the weight of an event that could change the course of many histories. Colonel Mendez picked up the radio again, her voice echoing with the same authority that had broken the sergeant's finger. "Central, Colonel Mendez. Inform General Command that zero-tolerance operation has begun. Request all units be notified of the new directive to combat corruption and abuse of authority, and tell them to prepare. The cleanup has started." She hung up the radio, feeling the weight of responsibility on her shoulders. That incident, though small in scale, was a microcosm of a much larger problem. Years of neglect, of turning a blind eye, of a self-protecting system, had allowed the weed of corruption to grow and spread. Her mission was to pull it out by the roots, not just prune the leaves. She looked at the young officers who had handcuffed Silva. They watched her with a mix of respect and apprehension. They knew the era of complacency had come to an end. Colonel Mendez was not just a figure of authority, she was a force of nature, a storm brewing on the horizon of the force. "Major," she said, her voice a little softer now, but still charged with purpose. "We'll need more people in internal affairs. And training, a lot of training. So these young people understand that the honor of the uniform is not a shield for cowardice, but an oath of service to the public." The major nodded, understanding the magnitude of the task. "It will be done, Colonel. Tis." As the last internal affairs vehicles drove away, taking with them the traces of that confrontation, Colonel Mendez remained there for a moment, alone on the curb. The midday sun beat down on her face, illuminating the determination in her eyes. Rua das Palmeiras slowly returned to its routine, but nothing would be the same. The seed of change had been planted, and Colonel Mendez was willing to water it with the truth, however painful it might be. She knew she would face resistance, that many would try to undermine her efforts, but she was ready. The war against corruption had been declared, and she was the general. Colonel Mendez remained there under the midday sun, feeling the warmth on her face, but a calculating coldness in her soul. Rua das Palmeiras, which just minutes before had seethed with tension and commotion, now breathed an almost palpable relief. The curious dispersed, the sirens faded in the distance, and the stage of that small revolution returned to its routine. But for her, the spectacle had only just begun. That Sergeant Silva was just the first domino to fall. She walked slowly to her car, a discreet model that didn't draw attention. As she opened the door, the stuffy interior seemed to swallow the residual street noise, plunging her into a heavy silence. The smell of leather and a faint disinfectant filled the air, a strange contrast to the scent of adrenaline that still seemed to cling to her skin. She sat behind the wheel but didn't start the engine immediately. Her eyes scanned the rearview mirror, observing the street that now seemed so ordinary, but which held the memory of a confrontation that would echo throughout the force. The image of Sergeant Silva, kneeling, his face contorted by pain and humiliation, gave her no satisfaction. It only confirmed the depth of the disease she had set out to cure. He was a symptom, a reflection of a toxic culture that had taken root, protected by silence and connivance. The hesitation of the young officers upon receiving the order to arrest a superior was a vivid reminder of the battle ahead. Blind loyalty, misinterpreted camaraderie, hierarchy used as a shield for impunity, all of it needed to be dismantled. She took a deep breath, the air feeling denser in her lungs. That disguise, the simulation of vulnerability, the risk of being discovered before the right moment, it had all been worth it. It was necessary to see with her own eyes, to feel on her own skin, to understand the audacity and arrogance of those who felt untouchable. And now she had the proof, the spark that would ignite the fire of change. She started the engine, the soft hum filling the cabin. As she drove through the busy streets, the traffic seemed like a labyrinth of interconnected problems, much like the web of corruption she was about to unravel. Each traffic light, each honk, each hurried pedestrian was a reminder of the society she had sworn to protect, and which was being betrayed by those who should be its guardians. Her phone rang. It was the Internal Affairs Major. "Colonel, the news is already spreading through the corridors." His voice sounded grave, almost a whisper. "Silva's battalion is in an uproar. Some are saying you went too far, that you broke protocols." Mendez gripped the steering wheel. "And some say I did what needed to be done, Major. Let them talk. The truth is a relentless mirror, and protocols are to protect the law, not to cover up criminals in uniform." "Understood, Colonel, but the resistance will be strong. Silva wasn't a lone wolf. He had connections, and many who benefit from the current system won't like this zero tolerance." "I know, Major, and I'm prepared. I want Internal Affairs to start operating at full strength, sweeps in all battalions, unexpected audits, strengthened anonymous reporting channels. I want every officer to feel they're being watched. That impunity is a mirage. This will create an earthquake, Colonel. Many will try to protect themselves, to organize. Let them organize. The more they stir, the more dirt will surface. I want names, Major, names of those who covered up, who omitted, who benefited. Rank doesn't matter. Length of service doesn't matter. The cleanup starts now, and it will be complete." She hung up the phone, feeling the weight of the decision. The drive back to headquarters seemed longer than usual. Each kilometer covered was an advance toward an invisible yet real battlefield. She knew that from that moment on, her personal and professional life would be under relentless scrutiny. Enemies would emerge from where she least expected, and the loyalty of some would be tested. As she parked the car in the reserved garage, the silence of the place was almost oppressive. Colonel Mendez was not just a figure of authority. She was now a symbol, a beacon of hope for the righteous and an omen of doom for the corrupt. As she exited the vehicle, she straightened her uniform, which now felt heavier, laden with the burden of her mission. Her footsteps echoed on the concrete, firm and determined. The war had been declared, and she, the general, was ready for the first battle. Rua das Palmeiras had been merely the prologue. The real confrontation was about to begin, and it would be fought in the corridors of power, in closed offices, and above all, in the very soul of the force. The silence in the headquarters garage was a somber prelude to the storm Colonel Mendez was about to unleash. Each step she took toward the elevator seemed to echo not only on the concrete, but also in the invisible corridors of power, where news of her intervention was already spreading like a virus. She knew that with each floor the elevator ascended, resistance solidified, enemies organized, and the old guard prepared for a counterattack. Upon reaching her floor, the atmosphere was different. The usual buzz of a normally functioning internal affairs department had been replaced by a tense, almost reverent silence. The few officers who crossed her path observed her with a mix of curiosity, fear, and, in some cases, a hint of admiration. Their gazes were like thermometers, measuring the temperature of a force in shock. She didn't linger, heading straight for her office, the solid wooden door seeming like a portal to the eye of the hurricane. The office, with its imposing desk and shelves filled with codes and reports, seemed to await her. The smell of paper and cold coffee hung in the air, a familiar fragrance that now carried the weight of a new era. She tossed her bag onto the auxiliary chair and sat down, without turning on the lights, letting the natural light streaming through the window illuminate the dust dancing in the air. It was a moment of quiet before the battle, a pause to recalibrate her mind and reaffirm her purpose. The phone rang, breaking the silence. It was the Internal Affairs Major again. His voice, previously just grave, now carried a tone of urgency. "Colonel, the situation is effervescent. We just received an anonymous call. An officer from Silva's battalion is trying to erase tracks, destroy documents." Mendez closed her eyes for an instant. "Expected, Major. The weed doesn't give up without a fight. I want a team on standby. Raid Silva's battalion immediately. Don't give them time to sweep the dirt under the rug." I want every document, every computer, every record seized and audited. No one leaves there without authorization." The Major's voice hesitated. "Colonel, this is a drastic action. It could be interpreted as an invasion, a generalized lack of trust." "It's a deserved lack of trust, Major, and it's a declaration. From now on, trust will be earned, not presumed. Those who have nothing to hide don't fear an audit. Those who do, let them tremble. This is zero tolerance in action, and I want the message to be clear. If they try to obstruct justice, they will be treated as criminals, not as colleagues." She hung up, feeling adrenaline pulsing through her veins. There was no room for half measures. Corruption was a cancer that required radical surgery. She stood and went to the window, watching the city stretch out under the afternoon sun. So many faces, so many lives, depending on the integrity of those who swore to protect them. The image of Sergeant Silver, his face contorted with pain and surprise, returned to her mind. He was just the tip of the iceberg, a glaring example of the impunity that had become the norm. Colonel Mendez knew that resistance would not come only from low-ranking officers. The true architects of the corrupt system were in the shadows, in positions of power, with networks of influence that extended throughout the force and beyond. They would try to discredit her, undermine her authority, perhaps even threaten her. But she was ready. Years of service, of silent observation, of accumulated frustrations had prepared her for this moment. She activated the intercom. "Secretary, please call a meeting with all Internal Affairs Department heads for an hour from now, and prepare a preliminary report on the incident on Rua das Palmeiras, with emphasis on its implications for the force. I want it distributed before the meeting." The secretary's voice, usually calm, sounded a little shaky. "Yes, Colonel, it will be done." While waiting, Mendez began to jot down the crucial points of her strategy on a notepad. First, the restructuring of reporting channels, ensuring anonymity and protection for whistleblowers. Second, the establishment of rotating and unexpected audit teams in all battalions. Third, an intensive training program in ethics and human rights, starting with cadets and extending to all levels of the hierarchy. Fourth, the creation of a working group focused exclusively on investigating and dismantling internal corruption networks, with full autonomy. She knew many would see her actions as a witch hunt, a betrayal of camaraderie. But for her, the true betrayal was against the uniform, against the law, against the citizen. The honor of the uniform was not in protecting the corrupt, but in purging them. The meeting time approached. Colonel Mendez felt a chill down her spine, not from fear, but from anticipation. Rua das Palmeiras had been the stage for an isolated act of abuse, but the Internal Affairs meeting room would be the starting point for a silent revolution, a war fought with documents, evidence, and the unwavering will to restore the force's dignity. She wasn't just cleaning house, she was rebuilding the foundations, and the real confrontation, the most difficult one, was about to begin. The department heads began to arrive one by one, their faces carrying a mix of apprehension and curiosity. The major of the audit division, with his glasses perched on his nose, seemed to have aged 10 years since she last saw him. The captain in charge of special investigations, usually impassive, displayed a wrinkle of concern between her eyebrows. The lieutenant colonel of the disciplinary sector, known for his rigidity, seemed strangely subdued. Mendez observed each of them, gauging the loyalty, cowardice, and potential resistance in their eyes. The secretary distributed the preliminary report, and the silence in the room grew even heavier, punctuated only by the rustling of paper. The officers' eyes scanned the pages, some with disbelief, others with a grim recognition. Mendez waited for everyone to be seated, the report read and digested. Finally, she stood, her imposing figure filling the space. There was no need for circumlocution. "Good afternoon, gentlemen, As the report indicates, the incident on Rua das Palmeiras was not an isolated case of misconduct. It was the tip of an iceberg of impunity and corruption that has taken root in our force. Her voice was calm, but charged with unquestionable authority. Sergeant Silva is merely a symptom. The disease is systemic. And starting today, internal affairs will undergo a profound restructuring. Zero tolerance is not a catchphrase, it is our new operational directive. A murmur ran through the room, but was quickly silenced by the colonel's penetrating gaze. I understand that some of you may be uncomfortable. You may think I'm going too far, that I'm breaking camaraderie. Let me be clear. Camaraderie that protects criminals in uniform is not loyalty. It is complicity, and complicity will be treated with the same severity as active corruption. She tapped the table lightly with her palm, a dry sound that echoed in the room. The Major has already received orders to raid Silva's battalion. I want each of you, in your respective departments, to prepare for an unprecedented sweep. Forensic audits, metadata analysis, tracking of financial flows. No one is above the law, and no one will be above the scrutiny of this internal affairs department. I want daily progress reports. I want anonymous reporting channels strengthened and publicized in all battalions. And I want every complaint investigated with the utmost priority and discretion. The Lieutenant Colonel of the disciplinary sector, a man of few words, finally broke the silence. Colonel, this will create chaos. Many will feel attacked, wronged. Mendez stared at him, her eyes flashing. Chaos already exists, Lieutenant Colonel. It's the chaos of impunity, of citizen distrust, of the stain on our uniform. My function is not to maintain the peace of the corrupt, but to restore order and honor. And if that means creating temporary chaos, then so be it. The cleanup is painful, but necessary. She paused, sweeping the room with her gaze again. There will be no untouchables. There will be no friends of the king. If a superior covered up, if a colleague omitted, if someone benefited from the corrupt system, they will be held accountable. And that includes anyone in this room who tries to obstruct this process. The war has been declared, gentlemen, and there will be no truce until the dignity of this force is fully restored. The room remained silent, but now it was a different kind of silence. No longer apprehension, but a grim and inevitable understanding. Colonel Mendez was not asking for permission. She was giving orders. And from that moment on, internal affairs would no longer be a reactive body, but a relentless force for change. The real confrontation was just beginning, and it would be fought in every office, in every report, in every interrogation. Rua das Palmeiras had been merely the beginning. The silence that followed Colonel Mendez's declaration was not one of acceptance, but of paralyzing shock. The department heads, once figures of unshakable authority, now seemed like chess pieces before a relentless player. Their gazes, previously filled with apprehension, transformed into a mix of forced respect and veiled terror. They knew the colonel wasn't bluffing. Zero tolerance was not an empty threat, but a sentence. One by one they rose, their movements slower and heavier than usual, as if the weight of the new reality dragged them down. Some nodded in a gesture of submission, others avoided eye contact, their minds already working on the implications for their own departments, for their own careers, for their own networks. Mendez watched them leave, each door closing with a sound that seemed to echo the inevitability of what was to come. She didn't see faces. She saw gears of a system, some rusty, others still turning with the force of the old order, but all now under her control. No sooner had the last department head's door closed than her desk phone rang again. It was the Internal Affairs Major. His voice, previously urgent, now vibrated with a different electricity, a mix of adrenaline and the contained satisfaction of someone completing a difficult mission. "Colonel, The team is at Silver's battalion. It's chaos. They tried to destroy documents, wipe hard drives. But we arrived in time. Our men are isolating everything. We've already found evidence of embezzlement and a scheme to protect offenders that goes far beyond Sergeant Silver. It's a rat's nest, Colonel. Mendez felt a shiver run down her spine, not from surprise, but from confirmation. The rot was deeper than imagined. Excellent, Major. I want every piece of paper, every bite of information catalogued and secured. No one leaves there without being searched, not even to use the restroom. And I want Sergeant Silver interrogated again, but this time with a prosecutor present. He will talk, Major. And when he talks, I want every name, every date, every amount. She hung up, the sound of the Major's voice still echoing in her ears. The operation had begun. The first stone had been moved, and the avalanche was underway. She returned to the window, the city below seeming oblivious to the silent war unfolding behind its scenes. Corruption was like a parasite, feeding on public trust, eroding the foundation of law and order, and now she was the scalpel. Night fell, but the work at Internal Affairs was far from over. Preliminary reports began to arrive. Piles of seized documents, initial testimonies from Silver's battalion officers, some shocked, others visibly terrified. The forensic audit team was already working tirelessly, diving into digital data, searching for the financial fingerprints of the scheme. With each new discovery, the web of corruption revealed itself to be more complex, more intricate, involving not only low-ranking officers, but also higher-ranking figures, whose names began to emerge as whispers in the reports. Mendez didn't allow herself to rest. She ordered coffee, more coffee, and continued to review every detail, every line. She knew speed was crucial. The old guard, the true architects of the system, would already be mobilizing. They would try to discredit the operation, plant false news, perhaps even threaten her men. The resistance would be fierce, and she needed to be one step ahead. In the middle of the night, a new report arrived. An initial analysis of Sergeant Silver's bank accounts revealed irregular deposits that didn't match his salary, but the most alarming aspect was the origin of some of these deposits. Shell companies linked to a well-known businessman in the civil construction sector, with multi-million-dollar government contracts. The businessman's name was a heavyweight with deep political connections. The tip of the iceberg had become a mountain. Mendez felt a chill in her stomach, but not from fear. It was the thrill of the hunt. The enemy was revealing itself. She knew that by touching that name, she would be declaring war on forces much larger than a simple corrupt battalion. She would be challenging the very system that allowed corruption to flourish. She activated the intercom. "Secretary, please prepare a complete dossier on fictional businessman's name and his companies. I want everything: contracts, bids, political donation history. And I want the financial investigation team to prioritize this connection. No one should know we're investigating this name yet. Absolute discretion." The secretary's voice, now firmer, replied, "Yes, Colonel, it will be done." Mendez knew that from that moment on, the battle would become much more dangerous. It wouldn't just be an internal cleanup, but a direct confrontation with the economic and political power that sustained corruption. Sergeant Silver, with his broken finger, was merely the prelude. Rua das Palmeiras had been the trigger. But the real war was starting now, in the silent offices of Internal Affairs, where truth was a weapon and justice the only possible victory. She was ready to fight, and there would be no turning back. The secretary's voice, previously a thin thread of submission, now sounded with a new firmness, an echo of the colonel's determination. "Yes, Colonel, it will be done." But Mendez knew that "it will be done" was just the beginning of a much larger battle, That name, the fictional businessman's, was a key that opened doors to a labyrinth of power and influence, where rules were written by money and not by justice. Night advanced, but for Mendez, time seemed to have stopped. She remained in her office, the light from the computer screen illuminating her face as the first fragments of the businessman's dossier began to emerge. Overpriced contracts, bids without competition, hefty political donations to campaigns of prominent figures. The web was vast, intricate, and extended far beyond the borders of Sergeant Silver's battalion. It was the system in its purest and most perverse form. The silence of the early morning was broken only by the incessant typing of forensic auditors and the muffled whispers of the financial investigation team, now working at a frantic pace. With each new discovery, the gravity of the situation intensified. It wasn't just about bribes to waive fines or protect offenders. It was the appropriation of public money, industrial-scale corruption, with tentacles reaching the highest echelons of politics and economy. Mendez felt the weight of responsibility, but she did not bend. On the contrary, each new piece of evidence ignited an even stronger flame in her chest. She had promised a cleanup, and she would not back down. The war had been declared, and she was ready to fight on all fronts. The next day, news of the unprecedented sweep in Sergeant Silver's battalion had already spread like wildfire. The chaos that the lieutenant colonel of the disciplinary sector had predicted was materializing, but not in the way he imagined. It was controlled chaos, a necessary implosion to expose the rot. The internal affairs phones didn't stop ringing. Some were anonymous tips, encouraged by the colonel's actions, revealing new names and schemes. Others were courtesy calls from political offices, questioning the excessive rigidity of internal affairs, suggesting that the operation could destabilize public order. Mendez ignored them all. For her, each call was just confirmation that she was on the right track. The major of the audit division, with deep, dark circles under his eyes, brought the latest updates. Colonel, Sergeant Silver finally started talking. With the prosecutor present and a guarantee of protection, he broke down. The names he's giving are shocking. They involve not only the businessman, but also a state representative and a municipal secretary. He detailed the monthly payment scheme for the battalion's leadership and how profits were divided, with a portion always going up, to ensure a blind eye was turned. Mendez listened, impassive, but inside, a wave of cold anger ran through her. Excellent, Major. I want every word recorded, transcribed, and validated. And I want the financial investigation team to cross-reference each name with the data we already have on the businessman. We cannot leave any loose ends. External pressure began to intensify. Anonymous articles started appearing on smaller blogs and news portals, insinuating that Colonel Mendez had political motivations or was persecuting members of the force for personal reasons. It was the old tactic of discrediting the messenger to divert attention from the message. An anonymous email, encrypted and sent from a foreign server, arrived in Internal Affairs inbox. The message was short and direct. Colonel, be careful. You're messing with big players. The system defends itself. Don't underestimate their ability to retaliate. Mendez read the message, an almost imperceptible smile appearing on her lips. It was a warning, a veiled threat, but for her, it was just another sign that she was on the right track. The system was feeling threatened, and that meant she was close to hitting a nerve. She called an emergency meeting with her closest team, the audit major, the special investigations captain, and the disciplinary sector lieutenant colonel, who now seemed to have understood the seriousness of the situation and the inevitability of change. "Gentlemen," Mendez began, her voice low but charged with an intensity that silenced any murmur. "The war I declared is not just against corruption within the police, it's against the power that feeds it, that protects it. Sergeant Silver is talking." And the names he's revealing lead us to a representative, a secretary, and the businessman we're already investigating. They won't stand idly by. She paused, sweeping her team's faces with her gaze. I expect the pressure to increase. Attempts at defamation, perhaps even more direct threats. I want everyone to be vigilant. Our communication channels will be encrypted, our movements discreet, and our determination unshakable. The Special Investigations Captain, usually reserved, spoke. Colonel, we're already receiving reports of strange movements. The businessman's lawyers are trying to access Silver's battalion records, and there are rumors that the representative is trying to use his influence to block our audits in other units. Exactly what I expected, Mendez replied, her gaze hardening. They're testing our limits, but we won't yield. I want the legal team to prepare search and seizure warrants for the businessmen's offices and for those politicians' offices. If they want to play, we'll play by the rules the law allows us, and we'll play to win. The silence in the room was different now. It wasn't one of apprehension, but of shared determination. They were in this together. Colonel Mendez had lit a fuse, and the explosion was imminent. Rua das Palmeiras had been merely the trigger. The real war, with its risks and rewards, was just beginning, and Mendez knew that every step from then on would be a direct challenge to the heart of power. Colonel Mendez's decision echoed through the room, a call to action that transformed apprehension into a sharp focus. The order to prepare search and seizure warrants against an influential businessman, a state representative, and a municipal secretary was not just a step. It was a leap into the abyss, a direct challenge to the heart of established power. The silence that followed was not one of hesitation, but of a grim understanding of the magnitude of the task. The Special Investigations Captain, with a look that mixed respect and a hint of concern, was the first to move. Her legal team, already overburdened, now faced the Herculean task of building irrefutable cases against figures with limitless resources to defend themselves. Every line of the warrant requests would need to be impeccable, every piece of evidence unquestionable. An error, however small, could be the pretext for dismantling the entire operation. Mendez knew that time was both her enemy and her ally. Speed was crucial to catch the system by surprise, but meticulousness was vital to ensure the actions were legally sound. She locked herself in her office again, the pile of documents on the businessman and politicians growing by the minute. The audit major brought updated reports on bank accounts, suspicious financial movements, the increasingly evident links between public money and private pockets. The night stretched on, a dark blanket over the city, while internal affairs buzzed with feverish activity. The legal team worked tirelessly, reviewing laws, precedents, building the arguments. Investigators cross-referenced data, verified sources, seeking the irrefutable proof that would justify invading the privacy and offices of such powerful men. The smell of strong coffee and palpable tension were the only companions in the silence of the early morning. As expected, the reaction was swift. The next morning, the first signs of a counterattack began to emerge, more aggressive and coordinated than the initial whispers. A widely circulated newspaper, known for its ties to political power, published a front-page story insinuating a witch hunt within internal affairs, questioning the legitimacy of the operation and the integrity of Colonel Mendez, citing anonymous sources who described her as ambitious and politically motivated. Simultaneously, lawyers for those involved filed a series of petitions in court seeking to block the audits, alleging abuse of power and violation of rights. It was a legal smokescreen designed to delay, confuse, and, if possible, paralyze the investigation. The pressure was immense, and Mendez felt the net closing in. But she was not intimidated. Each attack was confirmation that she was on the right track, that the scalpel was cutting deep. "They're desperate," she murmured to herself as she read the articles and petitions. "That means we're close." She called a new meeting, this time with the legal team and investigation heads. "I want an immediate response to each of these petitions. We will not yield an inch. And I want the communications team to prepare an official statement, clear and concise, reaffirming internal affairs commitment to legality and transparency. We will not play their game of gossip and innuendo." The Special Investigations Captain brought more troubling news. "Colonel, we received information that Sergeant Silver was transferred from his cell without prior notice to a maximum security wing. They claimed overcrowding issues, but it's clearly an attempt to isolate him and perhaps silence him." Mendez's face hardened. "That won't happen. Contact the prosecutor immediately. I want him to go to the location personally, ensure Sergeant Silver's safety, and reinforce the terms of the plea bargain. If necessary, we will request his transfer to a location under our direct custody. No one will touch a protected witness." The veiled threat transformed into direct action. The fight was no longer just in offices, but in prison corridors, in courts, and in the arena of public opinion. Colonel Mendez knew she was in a race against time, against an invisible yet powerful enemy operating in the shadows. At the end of the day, an unmarked envelope arrived on her desk. Inside, a single photo, the facade of her house, taken from an angle that suggested surveillance. There was no message, no words, just the image, cold and calculated. It was a personal threat, a warning that boundaries had been crossed. Mendez looked at the photo, her heart beating a steady rhythm, but her expression remained unchanged. She had anticipated this. She had prepared for this. The war was no longer just professional, it was personal. But instead of fear, she felt an even fiercer determination. She picked up the phone and called the audit major. "Major, I want you to reinforce the security of all members of my closest team, especially those dealing with the names of the businessmen and the politicians. And I want the intelligence team to start tracking any suspicious activity around our officers' residences. They're trying to intimidate us, but we won't back down." The major's voice, though tired, sounded firm. "Understood, Colonel. We're already mobilizing resources." Mendez hung up, the photo still in her hands. The darkness outside seemed denser, but within her a light burned brighter. The system had shown its claws, but she was ready to show her teeth. Rua das Palmeiras had been the trigger, but the real battle, the one that put her life and her teams at risk, was just beginning, and she had no intention of losing. The game was on, and the stakes were as high as possible. The photo of her house's facade, cold and calculated, didn't provoke fear in Mendez. Instead, it ignited an icy flame in her chest, a fire that burned with the intensity of determination. It was a warning, yes, but also a confirmation. They were desperate, they were scared, and that for the colonel was the greatest proof that she was on the right track. The personal threat was the line they shouldn't have crossed, and now Mendez had no more limits. "Major, I want security reinforced not just for me, but for everyone directly involved in this operation," she reiterated to the audit major, her voice low but sharp as a blade. 24-hour surveillance, altered routes, unmarked cars. And I want the intelligence team to start sweeping the area around our officers' residences. We will not give them the satisfaction of seeing us retreat. The order was executed with the urgency the situation demanded. Internal affairs, already a bastion of discretion, transformed into a fortress under siege. Each team member felt the weight of the threat, but the colonel's determination was contagious. They were in this war together, and the enemy had just declared war in very personal terms. The legal battle intensified. The petitions from the involved parties' lawyers, designed to delay and confuse, were answered with a speed and precision that surprised the defense. The Internal Affairs legal team, led by a captain with nerves of steel and a brilliant mind, dismantled every argument, every claim of abuse of power with irrefutable facts and jurisprudence. Mendez didn't just want to win. She wanted to humiliate the system on its own ground. "We won't just refute, Captain," Mendez instructed. "We'll counterattack. I want each of their petitions to be used as a basis to strengthen our own requests. Every attempt to discredit us will be a springboard to expose their rottenness." Meanwhile, Sergeant Silva's situation became more precarious. The prosecutor, contacted by Mendez, had gained access to him, confirming the conditions of isolation and the psychological pressure he was enduring. The transfer to the maximum security wing was a clear attempt to break his morale and eventually his will to inform. "Colonel, they're filing a habeas corpus for Sergeant Silva, claiming he's being held in private custody by Internal Affairs," the prosecutor informed, his voice laden with frustration. "It's a maneuver to get him out of our custody and likely silence him for good." Mendez clenched her fists. "We cannot allow that. Sergeant Silva is a victim and a protected witness. The prosecutor must vehemently argue that his life is at risk. Ask the judge to consider the gravity of the threats and the vital importance of his testimony for justice." The press, manipulated by hidden powers, continued its defamatory campaign. Articles questioning Mendez's integrity, insinuating political and even personal motivations, popped up in newspapers and online portals. But the colonel had anticipated this. Her communications team, under her guidance, released an official statement that, without going into investigation details, reaffirmed Internal Affairs' commitment to law, ethics, and transparency, and denounced attempts at intimidation and disinformation as desperate tactics from those who fear the truth. "We will not feed the gossip," Mendez declared at an impromptu press conference, her posture unshakable. "We will focus on the facts, and the facts, gentlemen, are being meticulously investigated. The truth will come out, and those who try to silence it will be held accountable." Each day, the pile of evidence against the businessman, the representative, and the secretary grew. The audit major presented detailed reports of offshore accounts, shell companies, and multi-million-dollar transfers. The Special Investigations Captain brought testimonies from low-ranking employees who, encouraged by Silva's courage and Mendez's determination, began to speak. The search and seizure warrants, meticulously prepared, were finally ready. Every line, every comma had been reviewed and approved by the legal team and by Mendez herself. They were the materialization of her promise, the sword that would cut the Gordian knot of corruption. "Gentlemen," Mendez said to her assembled team, her eyes gleaming with cold intensity, "the warrants have been issued. Tomorrow at dawn we will execute them. The businessmen's offices, the representatives, and the secretary's offices. I want each team to be composed of trusted officers without any history of involvement or vulnerability. No information can leak. No evidence can be compromised." The silence in the room was heavy, laden with tense anticipation. Everyone knew what that meant. It wasn't just an operation. It was the point of no return. Internal Affairs was about to invade the sanctuary of power, to expose its inner workings. "They will retaliate with everything they have," Mendez continued, her voice echoing in the room. "This is the most dangerous moment of our operation. Be prepared for anything, but remember, the law is on our side. The truth is on our side. And we will not stop until justice is done." The night that followed was a vigil. The smell of coffee mingled with adrenaline. Maps, floor plans, and approach strategies were reviewed one last time. The city slept, oblivious to the storm brewing behind the scenes at Internal Affairs. Mendez, in her office, looked at the photo of her house. The threat was there, real and palpable. But the colonel was no longer the harassed driver on Rua das Palmeiras. She was the hunter, and the game now was one of life or death. Dawn would bring the confrontation. Dawn arrived, not with the promise of a new day, but with the shadow of an impending storm. In the still dark streets, convoys of unmarked internal affairs vehicles moved silently, their occupants, elite officers, their faces marked by tension and determination. Each of them knew the weight of the mission, the magnitude of what was about to happen. It was not just another operation. It was the day Mendez's scalpel would cut into the deepest flesh of power. At Internal Affairs, the operations center hummed with the contained energy of a beehive about to swarm. Giant screens displayed city maps, GPS points of the convoys, and encrypted communication lines. Mendez, at the center of it all, was the calm in the eye of the hurricane. Her eyes, however, revealed the intensity of a hunter. She observed every movement, every report, her mind processing scenarios and anticipating reactions. Team Alpha on target, a captain's voice echoed through the loudspeakers, referring to the businessman's office. Door breached, initial resistance contained, entering. Almost simultaneously came the confirmation: Team Beta at the representative's office, access secured, initiating search. And then Team Gamma at the secretary's office, encountered security resistance, situation under control, entering. The targets, accustomed to impunity and the protection of their networks, were caught by surprise. The initial shock gave way to panic. In the businessman's luxurious offices, documents were frantically torn, computers attempted to be formatted. But the internal affairs teams were swift, trained for this. Signal jamming devices were activated, preventing any external communication. IT experts were already plugging in their equipment, recovering data that had barely been deleted. In the representative's office, the scene was one of controlled chaos. Papers flew, drawers were ransacked. The team found a safe hidden behind a bookshelf. "Colonel, we found a safe. We need to breach it." The audit major's voice came over the radio. "Proceed with utmost caution. Document everything," Mendez replied, her voice firm. Minutes later, the news she expected. "Safe open, Colonel. Hundreds of thousands in cash and agendas with coded notes. It appears to be a detailed record of payments and meetings." By this point, the city was beginning to wake up, but news of the operations was already spreading like wildfire. Journalists, alerted by still unknown sources, began to gather in front of public buildings and the businessman's office. Mendez's strategy of keeping the operation under maximum secrecy had been compromised, but the damage was already done. Evidence was being collected. "Colonel, the businessman is trying to call the governor. We're blocking the calls," one of the officers reported. "Maintain the block. No one speaks to anyone until the operation is concluded and all evidence is secure," Mendez ordered. She knew that attempts at interference would come from all sides and at all levels. Meanwhile, the parallel legal battle for Sergeant Silva's safety took on even more urgent contours. The prosecutor, under pressure, had secured an emergency hearing. Transfer to a federal unit was at stake, but the lawyers for those involved did everything to delay, arguing that internal affairs was kidnapping a witness. "Colonel, the prosecutor secured provisional transfer to a neutral military unit, but it's for 72 hours. We need the definitive federal order," the Special Investigations captain reported. 72 hours is enough to get him out of there. Ensure he is escorted by our trusted team. No one else, Mendez instructed, knowing Silva's life hung by a thread. With each passing hour, the pile of evidence at Internal Affairs grew. Seized hard drives, accounting documents, encrypted emails. The web of corruption began to unravel, revealing names, dates, and amounts that would shock the country. The audit major, with an exhausted but victorious smile, showed Mendez spreadsheets detailing millions in embezzlement, money laundering, and cascading bribes. But victory would not come without a price. In the middle of the afternoon, a new envelope arrived on Mendez's desk. This time, it wasn't just a photo. Inside, there was a small voodoo doll with a pin stuck in its heart and a small handwritten note. "You're playing with fire, Colonel, and fire burns." The threat was more explicit, more visceral. It was a reminder that even with all the evidence and all the operations, the enemy was still in the shadows, watching and ready to attack. Colonel Mendez looked at the doll, then at the photo of her house, which was still on her desk. She had crossed the line, and so had they. "Major!" she called, her voice maintaining calm, but with an edge of steel. "I want security doubled. For me, for my team, for Sergeant Silver, and I want the intelligence team to intensify the search for whoever is behind these threats. They are desperate, and when they are desperate, they are more dangerous." The war was no longer just professional. It was a confrontation of wills, a fight for survival. Rua das Palmeiras had been the trigger, but the real battle, the one that put her life and her teams at risk, was now at its peak, and Mendez, with the voodoo doll in one hand and the evidence of corruption in the other, had no intention of backing down. The game was on, and the stakes were as high as possible. Dawn had brought the confrontation, and the day was far from over. The voodoo doll, an archaic symbol of curse and fear, lay in Mendez's palm. It wasn't the first threat, but it was the most visceral, the most personal. The pin stuck in the heart of the small cloth doll seemed to echo a phantom pain in her own chest. But the colonel was not one to be shaken by superstitions. It was a warning, a declaration of war in unequivocal terms. The message was clear. They knew where to strike, and they would not hesitate to do so. "They're trying to destabilize me, Major," Mendez said, her voice a thread of steel as she handed the doll and the note to the forensics team. "We won't give them that pleasure. I want each of you, every officer involved in this operation, to be on maximum alert. Don't underestimate the capacity of these criminals." The order for doubled security was put into practice immediately. Unmarked patrol cars began to patrol the streets near internal affairs and the residences of key officers. Plainclothes agents were assigned to accompany team members, especially those with families. For Mendez, her home security was reinforced with an advanced monitoring system and a discreet but constant protection team. She knew the threat was real, but she refused to live under the yoke of fear. Her focus remained unshakable on the mission. As internal affairs fortified itself, the political and media storm intensified. News of the search and seizure warrants had exploded in the press, but not as Mendez expected. Media outlets, many still under the influence of the powerful, distorted the facts. Headlines screamed about abuse of power, witch hunts, and political persecution. The businessman, the representative, and the secretary, now under formal investigation, used their lawyers and press advisors to launch furious counterattacks, claiming innocence and denouncing internal affairs as an instrument of Colonel Mendez's personal revenge. "They're trying to turn public opinion against us, Colonel," the head of communications warned, showing a pile of newspaper clippings and social media posts. "Their narrative is that we're acting arbitrarily, without concrete evidence." Mendez listened attentively, her expression impassive. "Let them talk. Our evidence will speak louder. Prepare a new press conference, not to rebut the accusations, but to present the facts. And I want the audit major and the special investigations captain to be with me, ready to detail what we've found." The hastily called press conference was a spectacle of restraint and firmness. Mendez, flanked by her team, did not shy away from tricky questions. Instead, she presented with chilling calm the first results of the searches. Photos of piles of cash in secret safes, bank statements from offshore accounts, incriminating emails, and the coded agendas that the audit major had begun to decipher, revealing a complex network of bribes and favors. The truth, cold and irrefutable, began to pierce the smokescreen. "These are just the first steps of an investigation that will be long and meticulous," Mendez declared, her voice resonating with authority. "But what we already have is enough to show the gravity of the crimes being investigated. Internal affairs will not bow to political pressures or disinformation campaigns. Our commitment is to the law and to justice." While Mendez faced the media, the battle for Sergeant Silva's safety continued. The provisional transfer to the neutral military unit had been a relief, but the fragility of the situation was palpable. The defendant's lawyers, anticipating that Silva would be the key witness, were using every legal tactic to prevent his cooperation, alleging coercion and procedural irregularities. "Colonel, they're filing a habeas corpus for Sergeant Silva, claiming he's being held in private custody by Internal Affairs," the prosecutor informed, his voice laden with frustration. "It's a maneuver to get him out of our custody and likely silence him for good." Mendez clenched her fists. "We cannot allow that. Sergeant Silva is a victim and a protected witness. The prosecutor must vehemently argue that his life is at risk. Ask the judge to consider the gravity of the threats and the vital importance of his testimony for justice." The intelligence team, for its part, worked tirelessly to identify the origin of the threats. The voodoo doll and the handwritten note were analyzed for any clue, however small. Social media profiles of people linked to the investigated parties were monitored. Phone lines tapped under judicial authorization. The search was for any link, any indication of who was behind the escalation of intimidation. Night fell over the city, but at Internal Affairs the lights remained on. The smell of coffee and tension were constant. Mendez in her office reviewed reports, her eyes fixed on the names that began to connect in a complex diagram of power and corruption. With each new piece of evidence, each new testimony, the network became more visible, more palpable. But the sense of danger also grew. The threat of the voodoo doll was not just a bluff. Hours after the press conference, a disturbing incident was reported. One of Mendez's security team officers, who was monitoring her street, noticed a dark car parked at a considerable distance with its headlights off. As he approached, the vehicle sped off, disappearing into the darkness. There was no confrontation, but the message was clear. They were watching. Mendez received the report with cold calm. "They're testing our limits, Major. They're provoking us, but we won't yield, we won't back down." The colonel looked at the photo of her house, now under constant surveillance. Rua das Palmeiras had been the beginning of everything, an ignition point for a war that now consumed her life. She had transformed from victim to hunter, and the game, which began with trivial harassment, was now a fight for the soul of justice, with her own life and her team's as the highest stakes. The day had been a battle, and the night promised to be even longer and more dangerous. The truth was coming to light, but the price to pay for it was still uncertain. Night advanced, dense and heavy, and Internal Affairs, far from sleeping, buzzed in a tense vigil. The report about the dark car, which had crept through the shadows of Mendez Street before disappearing, was more than a mere incident. It was an icy reminder of the enemy's proximity. They weren't just observing, they were approaching, testing defenses, measuring determination. Colonel Mendez knew the provocation was calculated, a psychological game to sow fear. But fear, for her, was a catalyst, not a paralyzer. In the heavy silence of her office, as the city slept, Mendez reviewed the latest intelligence team reports. Forensic analysis of the voodoo doll and the handwritten note had revealed little, only confirming that the ink and paper were common, making direct tracing difficult. But the team had found a pattern, a subtle digital trail beginning to emerge from the depths of the internet. Fake profiles, anonymous messages on obscure forums, all with a common goal: to discredit internal affairs, and specifically Colonel Mendez. It was a war of narratives, fought both on the streets and on keyboards. Dawn brought with it the urgency of the habeas corpus hearing for Sergeant Silva. The courtroom was packed, a microcosm of the battle unfolding outside. On one side, the defendant's lawyers, imposing and articulate figures, vehemently argued that Silva was being coerced, held against his will, and that internal affairs was acting outside the law. On the other, the prosecutor, visibly exhausted but with unshakable determination, defended the need for Silva's protection, detailing the threats to his life and the vital importance of his testimony to dismantle the corruption network. Mendez observed from a discreet corner, every word, every gesture, a move on the chessboard. Silva's life, and with it, the integrity of the entire operation, hung by a thread. The judge, a man of grave demeanor and notorious experience, listened to everyone attentively, his expression impenetrable. The tension was almost unbearable, the air heavy with expectation. Finally, after hours of heated argument, the verdict. The judge, citing the gravity of the threats and the public interest in revealing the truth, denied the habeas corpus. Silva's custody would remain with Internal Affairs, but the decision came with a caveat. Internal Affairs would have to present within 48 hours a detailed and robust plan for the sergeant's permanent protection, under penalty of review of the decision. The victory was partial, a momentary relief, but the pressure to ensure Silva's safety only increased. Back at Internal Affairs, news of the judge's decision was met with a collective sigh of relief, quickly replaced by a new wave of work. The Special Investigations captain was already assembling a team to elaborate the protection plan, seeking federal units and even the possibility of a more permanent witness protection program. "We cannot fail him, Captain. Sergeant Silva's life is our top priority now," Mendez instructed, her voice laden with responsibility. Meanwhile, Mendez's press conference had in fact shaken the foundations. Images of piles of cash, bank statements, and incriminating emails had pierced the smokescreen of disinformation. Public opinion, initially divided, began to shift. Social media, previously dominated by attacks on internal affairs, now saw an increase in voices demanding justice and the punishment of the corrupt. But the reaction of the investigated parties was immediate and fierce. New newspaper articles, financed by the powerful, tried to discredit the evidence, alleging manipulation and fabrication. The media war was far from over, but Mendez had gained vital ground. The audit major, with his glasses perched on his nose and a pile of documents beside him, brought new revelations. "Colonel, we've deciphered a few more agendas. The codes reveal not only the bribe amounts, but also the names of shell companies used for money laundering. And most importantly, we found a series of transfers to accounts in tax havens, all linked to the same international law firm. This firm, it seems, is the financial heart of the entire operation." The discovery was monumental, a direct link to the money laundering structure that sustained the network. But with each step forward, the shadow of the threat seemed to lengthen. Late in the afternoon, a package arrived at Internal Affairs, addressed personally to Colonel Mendez. Inside there was no voodoo doll, but something more subtle and, in a way, more disturbing. A small, delicate child's wristwatch with its hands stopped at midnight. There was no note, no explicit message, but the meaning was unmistakable. It was a reminder that they knew not only where she lived, but also about her personal life, about the people dear to her. Mendez picked up the small watch, the cold metal in her palm, and a wave of icy fury ran through her. The threat had escalated, becoming even more personal, more intimate. It was no longer just about her own life, but about the lives of those she loved. "Major," she called, her voice low, but with an intensity that made the major raise his head. "I want the intelligence team to focus all their resources on this law firm, and I want them to reinforce the security of all the families of the officers involved. We will not give them a chance to hit us where it hurts most." The war had turned into a hunt, and the hunters, previously in the shadows, now revealed their claws. Rua das Palmeiras had been the trigger, but the real battle, the one that put not only Mendes's career but the lives of innocents at risk, was now at its boiling point. The clock stopped at midnight was a warning, an ultimatum, and Mendes, with the weight of responsibility on her shoulders, knew there was no turning back. The game was on, and the stakes were as high as possible. The night promised to be long and dawn uncertain. Colonel Mendes felt the weight of the child's watch in her palm, not just the cold metal, but the weight of a threat that had crossed the line from professional to personal, from an attack on the institution to a direct blow to the heart of her life. It wasn't a bluff. It wasn't a generic warning. It was the intimacy of terror, the certainty that they knew. They knew about her daughter, about her family. The icy fury that ran through her was not destructive, but purifying, transforming fear into an even fiercer determination. The game had changed, and the rules now were those of total war. "Major," her voice, though low, cut through the office silence like a blade. "I want the intelligence team to focus all their resources on this law firm. Every email, every call, every transaction. I want them to unravel this international web. And most importantly, I want them to reinforce the security of all the families of the officers involved. We will not give them a chance to hit us where it hurts most. We will not be victims." The order echoed through internal affairs, and the response was immediate. The Special Investigations Captain, with her team, plunged headfirst into elaborating the protection plan for Sergeant Silva. The 48 hours granted by the judge were a tight deadline, a Damocles sword hanging over everyone's heads. The neutral military unit, which once seemed safe, was now viewed with redoubled caution. The threat of the child's watch had made it clear that no place was truly impenetrable for those who held so much power and reach. Silva's protection plan wasn't just about guards and cameras. It was a complex operation of logistics, dissimulation, and coordination with federal agencies. The possibility of a more permanent, perhaps even international, witness protection program was being explored. But time was the cruelest enemy. As the team worked, the shadow of vulnerability loomed. A small error, a communication failure, and Silva's life would be irrevocably compromised. Meanwhile, the intelligence team, led by a major with an impeccable record in cybersecurity, began to map the structure of the international law firm. It was a digital fortress, protected by layers of encryption and servers spread across various countries. But internal affairs had its own specialists, ethical hackers, and digital forensic analysts who spoke the same language as the Internet's underworld. They began to look for vulnerabilities, for a backdoor, for any trace that could lead to the true masterminds behind the money laundering. With each line of code deciphered, each connection established, the corruption network revealed itself to be even vaster and more tentacular. The law firm was not just a facilitator, it was the nerve center, the spider at the heart of the web, moving billions in bribes and protecting the identities of corrupt politicians, businessmen, and officials. The discovery was both exhilarating and terrifying. They were close, dangerously close, to the top of the pyramid. The media war also intensified. Defamatory articles financed by the investigated parties appeared on obscure news portals, trying to discredit internal affairs and Colonel Mendes herself. Accusations of abuse of power, fabrication of evidence, political persecution. It was a coordinated attack designed to erode public trust and undermine the investigation's credibility. But Internal Affairs was not inert. A communications team under Mendes's direct supervision worked to counterattack, disseminating verified information, unmasking fake news, and keeping public opinion informed about the investigation's progress. The battle for truth was as crucial as the battle in the courts. Colonel Mendes's personal security was reinforced to unprecedented levels. Her house on Rua das Palmeiras, once a refuge, was now a fortress under constant surveillance. But the real battle was internal. The image of the child's watch, with its hands stopped at midnight, haunted her thoughts. She knew she couldn't afford to falter, not now that the stakes were so high. Silva's life, her team's integrity, her family's safety, everything depended on her resilience. On a rainy night, as the intelligence team conducted a deep scan of the law firm's servers, an alert went off. One of the fake profiles, which previously only defamed Internal Affairs, posted a pixelated photo of the Special Investigations Captain's home entrance, accompanied by a cryptic message. "Time stops for no one, not even for those who hide in the shadows." It was a direct escalation, a warning that the threat was not just for Mendes, but for all who dared to challenge them. The captain, upon receiving the news, felt a chill, but her voice remained calm. "They're desperate, Colonel. They're losing control. That means we're on the right track." Mendes nodded, her eyes fixed on a complex map showing the connections between the investigated parties, the law firm, and the tax havens. The network was almost complete. "Yes, Captain, we're on the right track. And now we're going to show them that their time, indeed, is running out." Night advanced, and the 48 hours for Sergeant Silva's protection were quickly running out. The meticulously elaborated extraction plan was activated. It wouldn't be a simple transport. It would be a large-scale dissimulation operation. 3 identical vehicles, with different routes and times, would depart from distinct points in the city. Silva, under heavy escort from elite agents, would be in one of them, while the others would serve as bait, drawing the enemy's attention. The neutral military unit, previously seen as a safe harbor, was discarded for the initial phase. Silva would be taken to a secret location, a safe house administered by a federal agency far from the jurisdiction and influence of the corrupt. With each kilometer traveled, the tension increased. Radios crackled with reports of suspicious movements, cars following closely. But Mendes's and her team's strategy proved effective. The decoys worked, diverting attention while the real convoy, on an unexpected route, headed for its final destination. Sergeant Silva, pale but determined, was finally delivered safely, his testimony recorded and sealed, ready to be used as the most potent weapon against the corruption network. As the Silva operation unfolded, Internal Affairs Intelligence Team, led by the cybersecurity major, delved into the digital entrails of the international law firm. It was a race against time, a battle of wits between the best hackers and the guardians of darkness. They found impenetrable firewalls, military-grade encryptions, and servers scattered across remote islands. But Internal Affairs Team had an advantage. Mendes's relentless determination and intimate knowledge of their adversaries' tactics. Hours passed, eyes fixed on screens displaying lines of code and complex network maps. Then an alert, a vulnerability, not a programming error, but an intentional backdoor, an access point left by a disgruntled former employee, or perhaps a miscalculation by the criminals themselves. It was a needle in the digital haystack, but they found it. The major, with an exhausted but victorious smile, typed the final sequence. The barriers fell. What they found was a treasure trove of information, not just money laundering spreadsheets and bank statements from tax havens, but encrypted emails revealing the complete hierarchy of the criminal organization. Names, dates, amounts. The corruption network extended far beyond what they imagined, reaching high echelons of government, the judiciary, and the private sector. The law firm was not just a facilitator. It was the brain behind an operation that siphoned billions, using bureaucracy and law to shield its crimes. Most shocking was the discovery of a file called Project Midnight. It was a detailed plan to discredit and eliminate anyone who dared to investigate the network. The child's watch, the photo of the captain's house, all were part of a strategy of intimidation and, if necessary, annihilation. Colonel Mendez, reading the details, felt an icy chill. They were playing hard, but now internal affairs held the cards. With the evidence in hand, Mendez acted with the precision of a surgeon. There would be no more generic press conferences. This time, it would be a direct attack. A communications team, working in conjunction with forensic analysts, prepared an irrefutable dossier with graphs, audio, and videos extracted from the invaded servers. The media, previously divided, would now be confronted with the raw, unvarnished truth. The final press conference was a watershed moment. Colonel Mendez, standing before a crowd of journalists with the image of the child's watch projected behind her, did not hesitate. She revealed every detail, every name, every transaction. Project Midnight was exposed in all its depraved glory. The public watched, stunned, as the truth unmasked the deception. Public opinion, previously manipulated, now clamored for justice. Arrests were swift and coordinated. With warrants issued based on irrefutable evidence, internal affairs teams, in conjunction with the federal police, acted simultaneously at various addresses. Politicians, businessmen, lawyers, and even some members of the judiciary were detained. The corruption network, once so powerful and untouchable, began to crumble. Colonel Mendez watched the news spread, headlines screaming about the biggest corruption scandal of the decade. The weight of the child's watch in her palm had transformed into the lightness of justice. Rua das Palmeiras, where it all began with a simple touch and a broken finger, had been the trigger for a revolution. The internal affairs colonel, who one day disguised herself as an ordinary driver, had uncovered a web of corruption that seemed unbreakable. The battle was far from over. The fight against corruption was a continuous cycle, but internal affairs had achieved a monumental victory. The night, previously uncertain, now promised a dawn of hope. Mendez knew that new challenges would come, new threats would emerge. But the message had been sent. Justice, however slow, would always find its way, and she, Colonel Mendez, would be there to ensure the scales of the law remained balanced.